By the time I noticed the boots in the delivery photo, the man was already on my porch. He had not come for the food. He had come to see if I would open the door. I was 29, living alone in a rented duplex on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in Columbus. It was the kind of place where people waved from driveways but rarely learned your name. My job at the hospital billing office had gone remote 3 days a week, and on the other 2 I processed claims under fluorescent lights that made everyone look drained. My mom called every Sunday and asked if I was eating real meals. My older brother, Ryan, texted crime articles with no context, like that counted as caring. I teased him, but still checked my locks before bed because of him. That rainy Thursday, I finished work after 9, too tired to cook and too wired to sleep. I ordered pad thai, changed into sweats, and listened to rain tick against the kitchen window. When the app buzzed, I thought dinner had arrived. The duplex was small, but it had become mine in little ways. A crooked blue rug by the couch, a row of chipped mugs above the sink, lavender hand soap in the bathroom, because my mom always said a place felt less temporary when it smelled like something you chose. The neighbor on my left, Mrs. Alvarez, left for night shifts around 8 and usually came home after sunrise. The unit on my right had been empty for weeks, which made the walls feel thinner somehow. Still, I liked the quiet. After years of roommates, silence felt like proof that I was finally in charge of my own life. The delivery app said my driver's name was Marcus. I watched the little car icon crawl down Henderson Avenue while rain smeared the glass of my front door. At 9:47, the app flashed, driver arriving. I muted the TV and waited for the usual knock or bag rustle on the porch. Nothing came. The icon stopped in front of my house, then disappeared, and the room suddenly felt too still. I gave it a minute because delivery drivers were always juggling 3 orders and a phone with 10% battery. When no one knocked, I opened the front door just enough to let the porch light spill out. Rain blew sideways across the boards. My welcome mat was soaked and empty. I checked behind the planter, then leaned farther out and looked toward the driveway. No car, no taillights, no paper bag getting ruined in the rain. I shut the door, annoyed more than afraid, and messaged through the app that the food was missing. 3 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Delivered. The photo was blurry, taken at an angle, but it showed my porch, my mat, and the bottom edge of my red front door. I pinched the screen to zoom in, mostly to prove they had sent the wrong house. That was when I saw them. A pair of muddy boots, barely visible behind the left porch column, toes pointed toward my door, like someone had been standing there while I looked outside. My body reacted before my mind caught up. I slid the deadbolt over as slowly as I could, then turned the porch light off. The house dropped into darkness, except for the TV flickering blue across the living room wall. I muted it and stood there with my phone in my hand, staring at the door. For a few seconds, nothing happened. I almost convinced myself the boots were part of a shadow, a trick from the rain, and a bad camera. Then the knob turned. Not hard, not like someone trying to scare me. It moved gently, testing, then released. I backed away so fast my heel hit the coffee table. The person outside didn't knock, didn't call my name, didn't say they had the wrong address. I heard the porch board creak, then slow steps moving along the side of the house. A window latch clicked in the dining room. I covered my mouth and dialed 911 while climbing the stairs, every step feeling too loud. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom, just as I heard the back gate squeal open. The dispatcher's voice became the only solid thing in world. She told me to sit low in the tub, keep the line open, and not answer any sound unless it was an officer calling my name. I could smell damp towels, shampoo, and the bleach cleaner I had used that morning. Downstairs, something pressed against the kitchen window. Then came the quiet scrape of metal on old wood. I thought of my mom's calls and Ryan's articles, ashamed of every time I had rolled my eyes. The sirens never came loud. Blue lights washed through the bathroom window, silent and sudden. An officer found him under my back deck, soaked through, lying flat in the mud. Later, at the ER, while a nurse checked my blood pressure, an officer said the man had been following delivery drivers, watching who opened doors alone. He had used my dinner as a test. I moved the next week. I still order food sometimes, but now safety is not a feeling I trust. It is a door I check twice, even when the world outside sounds quiet. I bought the house in October, right after my 32nd birthday, with a loan officer smiling too hard, and my mother crying in the kitchen like I had just left for college again. It was a small ranch-style place outside Dayton, nothing fancy, but it had a fenced backyard, a detached garage, and a maple tree that dropped red leaves all over the driveway. I worked billing at a dental office, so most days were predictable. Coffee at 6:40, traffic by 7:15, home around 5:30, with my lunch container still in my bag. My neighborhood was quiet in that Midwestern way, where people waved from porches but didn't ask questions. Next door, Mr. Alvarez fed stray cats. Across the street sat the only ugly spot, an abandoned 2-story house with warped boards over the lower windows. One upstairs curtain was always hanging loose, sometimes cracked open just enough to look like a tired eye. I told myself old houses moved in the wind, but some evenings, walking up my steps, I felt watched. For the first few weeks, I tried making the place feel mine. I painted the living room a soft gray, hung cheap curtains, and bought a security camera system after my brother Aaron said, "You're single and stubborn. At least be single and stubborn with cameras." He came over twice to help mount them, grumbling with a drill in his mouth while I held the ladder. There was one over the porch, one facing the driveway, and one inside the detached garage, because the side door didn't always latch unless you shoved it with your hip. My mom called every Sunday to ask if I was eating real food. I lied and said yes while microwaving soup. The abandoned house became part of the background, like the cracked sidewalk or the barking dog 3 doors down. Still, small things bothered me. A muddy footprint near my trash cans after a dry week. My back gate unhooked one morning. The upstairs curtain across the street shifted whenever I came home, slow and slight, like someone letting go. That Saturday was the first full day I'd had alone in months, and I treated it like a vacation. I washed sheets, cleaned the fridge, and opened every curtain to let in the thin November sun. By evening it had started raining, cold little taps against the gutters, and the house smelled like lemon cleaner and frozen pizza. Aaron texted asking if I wanted to come watch a game, but I was already in sweatpants, half asleep on the couch. Around midnight, my phone buzzed so hard on the coffee table that I jumped. Backyard motion detected. I opened the app with one eye half closed. The camera showed rain shining on the deck, the fence, the dark square of the garage. Nothing moved. I almost blamed the maple branches until another alert popped up, this time from inside the garage. The live feed took a second to load. At first I saw my bike, storage bins, the pull cord hanging from the ceiling. Then I noticed a shape near the workbench, upright and still, facing the camera like it knew exactly where to look. I don't remember standing up, only the cold rush of my bare feet hitting the hallway floor. The garage feed froze, then went black. Offline. My thumb slipped twice before I called 911. I locked my bedroom door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and whispered my address so quietly the dispatcher kept saying, "Ma'am, I need you to speak up." Every sound became something alive. Furnace clicks, rainwater in the downspout, the house settling around me like it was holding its breath. Red and blue lights finally washed across my ceiling. Officers searched the yard, garage, shed, closets, even under my bed after I admitted I was too scared to look. They found the garage side door open, the latch freshly bent, and wet prints on the concrete that faded near the alley fence. Nobody was there. Then an officer came back from across the street with his jaw tight and asked me, carefully, if I had ever been inside the abandoned house. They wouldn't let me go in, but I saw enough from my porch to understand that my life had cracked open. Flashlights moved behind the boarded windows. An officer carried out a plastic tub, then another. Later, a detective told me there were printed photographs inside, porches, backyards, bedroom windows, garages. Not just mine. Mine were the newest. Some showed my kitchen light on after work, my trash cans at the curb, my garage door open while Aaron installed shelves. One picture had me in the yard, blurry, holding a mug and laughing at something on my phone. They never found who took them. The house had no power, no clean fingerprints, and neighbors suddenly remembered seeing maybe a man, or maybe a car, but nothing useful. I stayed 3 more months because selling a house isn't as simple as fear. I slept with lights on, taped curtains shut, and jumped at every alert. When I finally left, I didn't feel brave. I felt wiser in the saddest way. A home is supposed to be where you stop looking over your shoulder, but I learned some shadows are human, and they only need you to stop paying attention. Back then, I worked closing shift at a little pharmacy, wedged between a laundromat and a pizza place on the east side of Columbus. It wasn't one of those bright chain stores with music playing and polished floors. It was narrow, old, and smelled like rubbing alcohol, printer ink, and whatever soup Marcy warmed up in the break room. Marcy was 50-something, divorced, loud in a comforting way, and she treated me like a son even though I was 27, and kept insisting I was fine. Mr. Patel, the pharmacist, was quiet and precise, the kind of man who aligned pill bottles by label height when he was anxious. I liked the routine: count drawers, lock the controlled cabinet, pull the metal gate halfway down, text my sister, leaving now, because she worried. My apartment was 15 minutes away if I cut past the church and the bus stops on Grant. I told myself walking saved gas, and cleared my head, but that night the rain made every empty window look awake. It had been drizzling since dinner, the kind of cold rain that sneaks under your collar instead of falling hard enough to justify an umbrella. Marcy offered me a ride before she left at 10, but I stayed to help Mr. Patel finish inventory because a shipment had come in wrong. "You sure?" she asked, keys jingling in her hand. "I'm good," I said, smiling like I wasn't tired enough to sleep standing up. By 12:18, I stepped outside and locked the pharmacy door behind me. The pizza place was dark, the laundromat machines spinning with nobody inside, and the streetlights smeared yellow across the wet pavement. I pulled my hood up and started walking. At the first bus shelter, across from the church parking lot, a man stood with his hands in the pockets of a dark rain jacket. Nothing about him screamed danger. He didn't stare, didn't move, didn't say a word. Still, as I passed, I noticed his shoes were pointed toward me, and that made my skin tighten. I told myself not to be weird. People waited for buses. People had bad nights. People stood under shelters in the rain, because that was what shelters were for. A block later, I glanced back and saw only the empty sidewalk shining behind me. That should have settled me, but it didn't. The rain muffled the world, making my own footsteps sound separate from my body. When I reached the second shelter by the closed barber shop, the man was there again. Same jacket, same lowered head, same hands buried in his pockets. My stomach dipped so hard I slowed without meaning to. He never looked up, and somehow that was worse than if he had. I crossed the street, pretending to check my phone, and called my sister. Voicemail. Of course. She worked mornings, and slept like the dead. I left a stupid message about rain and work, just to hear my own voice. Then, near the final bus stop before my building, I saw him waiting under the glass roof, rain dripping from his sleeves. I stopped walking, just stopped right there in the middle of the sidewalk with rain sliding down my face. The logical part of me tried to arrange the facts into something harmless. Maybe there were shortcuts I didn't know. Maybe I had mistaken 3 different men for one because I was tired. but his right pant leg had the same pale streak of mud near the ankle, and once I saw that, my body made the decision before my pride could argue. I walked faster, then faster still, keys clenched between my fingers like Marcy had taught me. My building was an old brick 3-story, with a buzzing lobby light and carpet that always smelled faintly damp. I punched in the code wrong once, cursed under my breath, then got it right. As the lobby door clicked shut behind me, another sound came through the rain. Footsteps. Not far away, not across the street, right behind me, reaching the entrance before the lock had fully caught. I took the stairs 2 at a time, lungs burning, trying not to make enough noise to tell him which floor was mine, even though there were only 6 apartments in the whole building. Inside, I locked the deadbolt, chain, and the cheap sliding latch my landlord said was mostly decorative. Then I killed the lights and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty at first, yellow and still. A minute later, a shape stepped into view and stopped outside my door. He didn't knock. He didn't try the handle. He just stood there breathing softly enough that I wondered if I was imagining it. 10 minutes passed like that. When his footsteps finally moved away, I slid down the wall, shaking with relief, so hard my teeth clicked. Then metal scraped in my bedroom. My window faced the fire escape. I ran to the bathroom, locked myself inside, and called 911 while glass creaked in its frame. Police caught him halfway through the window, one muddy shoe on my floor. Later they said he'd followed late-night workers for months, waiting for someone to lead him home. I still walk fast in the rain, and I still look at bus shelters like they remember me. I had only been in Willow Creek for 6 weeks, which was long enough to learn the trash schedule, but not long enough to feel like I belonged. I moved there after my company went fully remote, trading my noisy 1-bedroom in Cleveland for a small beige rental house, with white shutters, and a maple tree that scratched the roof when the wind picked up. My mom loved the place from the pictures. "It looks peaceful," she said, which was her way of asking if I was lonely. I was, a little. I worked at the kitchen table most days, drank too much coffee, and waved at neighbors I didn't really know. Mark and Judy next door were the closest thing I had to friends on the street. Judy brought over banana bread my first week, and Mark once helped me drag a heavy Amazon box inside without making me feel helpless. That Saturday evening, they packed their SUV for a weekend trip. Judy called across the driveway, "You'll hold down the fort?" I laughed and said, "I'll try." Then their taillights disappeared, and the street went strangely still. I made a frozen pizza around 7 and ate it standing at the counter because I still hadn't bought a proper dining set. Outside, the air was warm and damp, the kind of late summer night where every sound seemed to travel farther than it should. A dog barked 2 streets over. A pickup rolled past too slowly, then turned at the corner. I told myself I was just adjusting. In the apartment, noise had meant people. Here, quiet felt like something waiting. Around 9, I was folding laundry in the living room when my doorbell rang. The chime made me jump so hard I dropped a towel. Through the peephole, I saw a man in a dark baseball cap standing with his hands raised a little, like he already knew I'd be nervous. "Sorry," he said through the door. "Wrong house. My bad." His voice sounded embarrassed, almost polite. I didn't answer right away. "No problem," I finally said. He nodded, even though he couldn't see me clearly, walked down the porch steps, and turned toward the sidewalk. I watched until he passed under the streetlight, but something about his pace felt too calm. I called my mom after that, not because I thought anything was wrong, but because hearing her talk about normal things made the house feel less hollow. She told me my dad had burned garlic bread again, and that my nephew had learned to say truck in a way that sounded inappropriate. I laughed, but I kept glancing toward the front window. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, just getting used to suburban silence. After we hung up, I checked the locks, more out of habit than fear. The front deadbolt clicked solidly. The back door in the kitchen had an old brass lock that stuck unless I lifted the handle first. At a little after 10, someone knocked on that back door. Not loud, just 3 steady taps. My body went cold before my brain caught up. The kitchen smelled like dish soap and cooling pizza sauce. I stood there barefoot on the tile, staring at the dark rectangle of glass in the door. A voice said, "Hey, I'm looking for Chris." He said this was his place. It was the same man from the porch. I didn't move closer. "You have the wrong house," I said, trying to keep my voice flat. He gave a soft laugh, like I was the one making things awkward. "Are you sure?" He told me beige house, maple tree, back entrance. That detail made my mouth go dry. Nobody named Chris lives here. There was a pause long enough for me to hear insects ticking in the bushes outside. Then he said, "Can you just open up for a second? My phone's dead." I looked at my own phone on the counter and thought about calling someone, but part of me still wanted to believe this was a stupid misunderstanding. "No," I said, "you need to leave." His tone changed, not angry exactly, just empty. "All right, sorry to bother you." I heard his shoes on the small wooden steps, then the side gate creak. I waited 10 full minutes before I breathed normally again. By 11:30, I had every downstairs light on and a kitchen chair wedged under the back doorknob, even though I felt ridiculous doing it. Then my smart doorbell buzzed against the counter. The motion alert opened to a grainy black and white view of my porch. The man in the cap was back, but he wasn't alone. Another person moved along my side yard, crouching near the windows. A third shadow stood at the backyard fence, one hand on the latch. They weren't talking. They weren't drunk or lost. They were working. I called 911 with my thumb shaking so badly, I almost dropped the phone. The dispatcher told me to get upstairs, lock myself in a room, and stay quiet. I crawled into my office closet behind a stack of printer paper, listening to the house settle around me. Downstairs, the side gate clicked. Then came a soft scrape against glass. When the sirens finally rose in the distance, I heard feet pounding through wet grass, then car doors somewhere beyond the trees. Police found pry marks on a basement window and shoe prints in the flower bed. A detective later told me the first visits were tests, ways to see if I lived alone and whether I'd open the door. I moved 3 months later. I still work from home, but I keep my blinds closed now, and I never mistake quiet for safety. I moved to Ohio for a project management job that sounded better over Zoom than it felt in real life. The city was flat, gray, and polite in a way that made loneliness feel embarrassing. I rented half of an old Victorian on Maple Street because it had a porch, cheap rent, and a small office with morning light. My landlord, Mr. Kessler, was a soft-spoken retired electrician who wore tucked-in flannels and smelled faintly of coffee. He told me the attic was locked because the floorboards were bad. "Old houses make old house noises," he said, handing me the keys. I believed him because I wanted to. Most evenings, I worked late, microwaved dinner, called my mom, then watched TV until the room stopped feeling empty. By the second month, I knew every creak in that house, except the one that started at 1:03 every morning above my bed. At first, I treated it like a private joke between me and the house. I would look up from my pillow and whisper, "Settle down," like scolding an old dog. During the day, the place seemed harmless. Sunlight came through the wavy glass windows, dust floated over the hardwood, and the radiators clicked even when they were off. My coworker Leanne came over once with takeout and said the place had divorced English teacher energy, which made me laugh harder than it deserved to. I wanted to love it there. I wanted the move to mean I was brave, not just lonely. But little things bothered me. A kitchen cabinet would be open after I was sure I'd closed it. The back hall smelled like wet leaves with the door locked. One morning, a letter from my mailbox sat on the entry table, damp along one edge, and I blamed myself for bringing it in half asleep. Fear offered me a ridiculous answer, and I took it. because the real one was waiting upstairs. The rain started on a Thursday and didn't let up until the neighborhood smelled like mud and clogged gutters. I worked from my dining room table all day, listening to tires hiss down the street and my boss talk in circles about deadlines. By 6, I was tired enough to order Thai food and eat it straight from the container. I remember feeling almost happy. The house was warm, the rain was steady, and for once I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. Then I went to throw the bag away and saw the first footprint. It was near the back hall, dark and wet, pressed into the wood grain. Another sat 3 feet ahead of it, then another. They led past the coat closet and up the narrow attic staircase. I stood there with the trash bag in my hand, waiting for my brain to explain it. My boots were dry by the door. My windows were locked. At the top of the stairs, the attic door sat open an inch, and the brass padlock hung from the latch, like someone had put it back for show. I did not run. I think that saved me. I backed into the kitchen one careful step at a time, keeping my eyes on that black crack of attic doorway. My phone was beside the sink, still plugged in. When the dispatcher answered, my voice came out so thin I barely recognized it. I told her someone might be inside my house. She asked if I could leave safely. I looked toward the front door, 15 feet away, and then I heard a board groan above me. "No," I whispered. She told me to hide and stay quiet. I crouched behind the living room sofa, where the carpet smelled like dust and old lemon cleaner. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. Then the attic door opened wider. A foot touched the first stair, then the next. Slow, patient, careful. Halfway down, the footsteps stopped. I saw a shadow bend, like someone was listening. My own breathing sounded enormous. Red and blue light finally flashed across the curtains, and the shadow moved back up fast. The officers found him behind old furniture under the slanted roof, wedged between a rolled rug and cracked dresser mirror. He wasn't wild-eyed or drunk. He was quiet, clean-shaven, wearing a gray hoodie with the sleeves cuffed. That made it worse. His backpack held canned soup, flashlights, gloves, a screwdriver, and mail from nearby houses. An officer showed me the roof vent later. It lifted from outside, hidden behind the chimney where no one on the street would notice. He had been coming in after dark, waiting above me, and leaving before morning. Sometimes, they said, he probably stayed all day. Mr. Kessler apologized on the porch, rubbing his hands until his knuckles turned red. I nodded because I had no energy left for anger. I packed before sunrise and left my dishes in the sink. For months afterward, every upstairs sound made my stomach drop. I used to think safety was a feeling a place gave you. Now I know it is something you verify before you close your eyes. The first knock came from under the floor, slow enough to sound almost polite. By the third one, I was standing barefoot in my dead grandfather's hallway, holding a kitchen knife I knew I would never be brave enough to use. I inherited the farmhouse that spring, though calling it an inheritance made it sound kinder than it was. Grandpa Earl had spent his last years in a nursing home outside Topeka, angry at his lungs, the food, the nurses, and anyone who suggested selling the place. My dad wanted nothing to do with it. He said the house had eaten enough of our family's time. So I drove out alone on a Friday after work with trash bags, gloves, and the plan to clean just enough for a realtor. The place sat at the end of a gravel road, gray and leaning, with wheat fields behind it, and a broken wind chime tapping the porch. I could still smell Grandpa's pipe tobacco in the curtains. By sunset, the house felt less empty than waiting. There had been no real electricity in the farmhouse for years, just a little gas generator my uncle had rigged up to run the kitchen lights, one outlet upstairs, and the refrigerator that no longer held anything but baking soda and mouse traps. I spent Saturday hauling boxes from the parlor, sneezing through dust, finding old church bulletins, mason jars, and birthday cards my grandmother had saved before she died. I hated how emotional it made me. I kept hearing my dad's voice saying, "Don't let that place get in your head." Around 9, I made instant coffee on a camp stove and sat upstairs in Grandpa's old bedroom with a paperback I had brought but couldn't focus on. Outside, wind pushed dry grass against the siding. The generator coughed behind the shed, steady and ugly. Around midnight, I noticed a thin orange glow under the basement door at the end of the hall. I stared at it for a long time, telling myself I had left some light on, even though I knew I hadn't. The basement door had always bothered me as a kid. It was narrow, painted brown, and swollen from years of damp weather. Grandpa used to keep it hooked with a little brass latch, because he said raccoons got in sometimes. I stood in front of it now, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No whispering. Only the generator outside, and the wind dragging branches across the roof like fingernails. "Hello?" I called, feeling stupid the second I said it. No one answered. I opened the door, and the smell hit me first. Wet dirt and old concrete. The glow came from below, flickering against the stairwell wall. I took 3 steps down, then 5. Halfway, I realized it wasn't from any bulb. It moved too softly. It was a lantern, sitting somewhere around the corner at the bottom. My mouth went dry. I leaned forward, trying to see who had left it there, and the flame disappeared. Not dimmed, not burned out, covered. The basement went completely black beneath me. I don't remember turning around, only the pain in my shin when I slammed into a step and kept climbing anyway. I threw myself into the hall, shut the basement door, and jammed the latch down with shaking fingers. Then I dragged Grandpa's old dresser in front of it, the feet screaming across the wood. My phone had 1 bar near the upstairs window. I called the county sheriff and whispered my address, like speaking louder would invite whatever was below me closer. The dispatcher told me deputies were on the way, but the farmhouse sat 20 minutes from town on a good night. I crouched near the window, watching the driveway and the black fields beyond it. Then came the knocking. 3 slow taps from under the floorboards. A pause. 3 more. My skin tightened until it hurt. The basement handle rattled once, softly, testing, then harder. The dresser shifted an inch. I backed away, staring at that door, and heard a man cough on the other side. The deputies arrived without sirens, 2 cruisers rolling up the gravel, with their headlights bouncing across the porch. I ran outside so fast I forgot my shoes. 1 deputy put me in the back of his cruiser, while the others went in with flashlights and hands near their holsters. Through the windshield, I watched the house pulse with white beams behind the windows. It looked alive, in a way it never had when my family owned it. They forced the basement open and found no one. What they found was worse in a quieter way. A panel behind the furnace, fresh scrape marks in the dirt, and a tunnel leading to an abandoned storm shelter hidden in the tree line. There were blankets, canned beans, water jugs, cigarette butts, and mail with Grandpa's name on it. Whoever had been living there had slipped out before the deputies reached the shelter. A month later, I watched the farmhouse come down. I felt relief, but not peace. Some houses keep secrets. Mine had been keeping a person. My wife, Emily, hated leaving on that trip, even though she tried to act casual about it. Her mother had just come home after a rough hospital stay, and Emily's sister needed help getting the house ready, so she packed a weekend bag while apologizing every 5 minutes. I kept telling her, "We'll be fine," like I was some seasoned dad instead of a guy who still checked the diaper tabs 3 times. Our daughter, Lily, was 6 months old, all soft cheeks and tiny fists, the kind of baby who made tired people speak in whispers without meaning to. That Friday evening, after Emily kissed us both goodbye, the house felt too clean and too quiet. I made frozen lasagna, forgot to eat half of it, and carried Lily around the living room, while rain tapped against the windows. By 9, I had her upstairs in the nursery, the little nightlight glowing beside the crib, and I stood there longer than I needed to, watching her breathe until the monitor crackled beside my hand. We had bought that baby monitor because Emily wanted the one with the clearest video and the two-way talk feature. I used to tease her about it, saying Lily didn't need a security detail, but that night I was grateful for the little screen on the coffee table. I settled on the couch with a blanket, a half-finished beer, and some action movie I barely followed. Every few minutes I glanced down. Lily slept with one arm above her head, her mouth slightly open, peaceful in a way that made my chest ache. Around 11, I checked the doors like Emily always asked me to do. Front locked, sliding door locked, kitchen window locked, though the latch stuck if you didn't push it hard. The rain had turned heavier, washing the backyard into blurry shadows. I remember thinking the house had its own sleepy rhythm, furnace humming, refrigerator clicking, floorboards settling. Then, close to midnight, the monitor hissed with static so sharp I sat up, and a man's voice whispered, "He's asleep now." I froze with the remote still in my hand. The voice had been soft, almost bored, like someone standing in another room trying not to wake anybody. My first thought was interference. We lived in a tight subdivision, and the houses behind us were close enough that I could smell somebody grilling in the summer. I stared at the monitor. Lily was still asleep. Nothing moved in the nursery except the slow pulse of the camera's night vision. "Great," I muttered, trying to sound annoyed instead of scared. I muted the monitor and listened to the house with my whole body. Nothing, just rain and the movie playing low. I almost texted Emily, but I didn't want to worry her or admit I was jumpy on my first solo weekend. Then the monitor lit up again even though I had muted it. A thin burst of static rolled out, followed by the same quiet voice, closer this time, whispering, "Lily's still sleeping." I ran upstairs so fast I hit my shoulder on the hallway wall. Lily's door was open exactly how I'd left it, and for one terrible second I expected to see a man bent over her crib. But the nursery was empty. Her stuffed rabbit sat beside the dresser. The laundry basket was still tipped against the closet. Lily stirred, made a tiny frown, and settled again. I grabbed her without thinking, holding her against my chest as her warm breath dampened my shirt. That was when I heard it below us. One slow footstep, then another. Not the house settling, not rain, a real person shifting weight on our hardwood floor. My mouth went dry so completely I couldn't swallow. I backed into the nursery, locked the door, and dragged the rocking chair in front of it while Lily began to whimper. With one hand under her head, I called 911 and whispered, "Someone is in my house," just as the stair at the bottom creaked. The dispatcher kept me talking while I sat on the floor with my back against the crib. Lily pressed to my chest, her cries muffled against my shoulder. I heard movement downstairs, then silence, then the distant rise of sirens cutting through the rain. Whoever was in the house heard them too. A door slammed hard enough to shake the nursery window. When officers came up, one of them said my name gently through the door before I let them in. They found the back door forced open near the kitchen. The frame splintered where the lock had given way. Muddy footprints crossed the tile, past the baby bottles drying by the sink, and stopped near the staircase. Later, an investigator explained that the intruder had used the monitor's two-way button from inside the house, probably thinking I had fallen asleep on the couch. We replaced the monitor, fixed the door, and added cameras, but none of that fixed me. I still wake up at night and listen too hard, because silence, I learned, does not always mean you are alone. I was 34 then, old enough to know better, and still young enough to pretend I was fine walking anywhere alone. I lived in a narrow blue house on Maple Street, with a sagging porch, and a backyard barely big enough for 2 patio chairs I never used. My sister, Claire, hated it. She said the locks looked cheap, and the alley behind it felt like somewhere people left bad decisions. My dad called the neighborhood up and coming, which was his gentle way of admitting it wasn't there yet. I worked payroll at a dental supply company, answered emails all day, and came home to tea, leftovers, and the lamp over my kitchen sink. That Friday, I almost canceled on Mara's birthday dinner. because rain had been hanging in the air since lunch. But she texted, "You're not bailing, recluse." And I laughed because she knew me. By 9, we were packed around a sticky table, sharing fries and bad dating stories, and I had no idea how badly I'd want that noise back. Dinner ran long because Mara kept ordering one last dessert, and by the time we stepped outside, downtown had that wet black shine it gets after light rain. Claire called while I was hugging everyone goodbye. "Want me to grab you?" she asked, her baby fussing in the background. I told her no. The rideshare was surging, the bus was late, and Bishop Park cut almost straight to my block. I had taken it a dozen times in daylight, usually with coffee in hand. At night, it felt borrowed from another city. The basketball courts were empty, the fountain was off, and the trees threw broken shadows over the path. I noticed the jogger by his breathing first, steady and close behind me, then by his gray hoodie passing on my left. He didn't look at me. He just ran ahead until the path curved near the pond. 5 minutes later, after I turned to avoid a flooded section, he came toward me again from the opposite direction. I told myself loops were normal. Joggers ran loops. People had routines. My brain, which could turn a noise in the dryer into a crime scene, was just doing what it did best. Still, I changed direction again, taking the path by the maintenance shed, where the air smelled like wet mulch and old leaves. The park was so quiet I could hear traffic hissing 2 blocks away. Then the same shoes slapped pavement behind me, not fast, not slow, just close enough to keep matching my fear. I didn't run. Instead, I called Mara and talked too loudly about her cake, her candles, anything. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, watching the jogger stop under a lamp and bend like he was tying his shoe. "Just keep me company." I reached Maple Street at 11:27, hands shaking so hard I dropped my keys on the porch. Inside, I locked the deadbolt, chain, and back door, then made chamomile tea, because that's what calm people do. When I pulled the kitchen blinds, he was across the street, facing my house. For nearly 15 minutes, I stood with my shoulder against the refrigerator and watched him through the gap in the blinds. He didn't smoke, check his phone, or stretch. He just stood there, hood low, rain dripping from it. I texted Claire, then erased it, because I could already hear her panic. At 11:44, a car rolled by, and his head turned with it. When the street went quiet again, he was gone. I told myself he lived nearby, that I had turned a tired runner into a monster. I washed my mug twice, and went upstairs, leaving every light on. Around 1, the backyard motion lights flashed through my curtains. The glare filled the room like lightning. I crawled to the side window and looked down. The grass below my deck was torn up with muddy footprints. They circled the back door, crossed to the basement window, then curved toward the side gate. More prints sat under the kitchen window, deep and still looking. I called 911, whispering my address, and then every light in the house went dead. The silence after the power cut was worse than a scream. My furnace stopped. The refrigerator clicked off. The dispatcher kept saying, "Stay on the line," while I crawled into the hall closet with my knees pressed to my chest. My phone flashlight made a weak circle against coats and a box of ribbon. Downstairs, something tapped the dining room window, then another window, then the kitchen one, lifted an inch, and slammed shut against the lock. He was testing them, patient as a person checking fruit at a grocery store. By the time red and blue lights washed over my ceiling, I was crying without making noise. The officers found nobody, but beneath my deck they pulled out a black backpack, climbing gloves, duct tape, a cheap pry bar, and a sweatshirt soaked at the cuffs. One officer said, softly, "You did everything right." I didn't feel right. I sold the house 6 months later. I still take the long way home even in daylight, because safety is a habit I practice, one locked door at a time. I had lived alone for almost 3 years by then, long enough to have my own little systems for everything. work bag on the chair by the garage door, keys in the blue bowl, shoes kicked off under the kitchen table even though I always promised myself I'd stop doing that. My house was small, a one-story ranch with a finished room upstairs that I used as an office, and an attached garage that made me feel safer than parking outside. My mom hated that I lived alone. She called every Sunday night and asked if I was being careful, which meant checking windows, not leaving the porch light out, and not trusting men who smiled too easily. My older brother, Nate, teased me for being cautious, but he still installed a brighter bulb over my driveway when I moved in. I worked at a physical therapy clinic, mostly front desk and insurance paperwork, and by Friday evenings, my brain felt like wet cardboard. That night, all I wanted was soup, a shower, and silence. I pulled into the garage after work, with 2 grocery bags cutting into my fingers and rain ticking against the roof, and I never noticed the garage door staying open behind me. I remember the house smelling like cold air and laundry detergent when I stepped inside. I had washed towels that morning and forgotten them in the dryer, so the whole kitchen had that warm cotton smell drifting in from the hallway. I set the groceries on the counter, fed my cat, Mabel, and listened to her complain like I'd been gone for a week instead of 9 hours. The clinic had been awful that day. A patient yelled at me over a copay, my manager cried in the supply closet, and by the time I left, my shoulders felt like they were nailed to my neck. I put a carton of eggs in the fridge, made tea I forgot to drink, and changed into sweatpants. Outside, cars hissed along the wet street. Everything felt ordinary in that tired, almost comforting way. Around 8, Nate texted me a picture of his kids eating spaghetti with sauce all over their faces. I laughed for the first time all day. Then, just as I was rinsing my mug, I heard a soft mechanical hum from somewhere behind me and realized what it was. The garage door. I had never closed it. My stomach dropped in that small, embarrassed way it does when you catch yourself being careless. I muttered, "Idiot!" under my breath, and walked toward the kitchen door that led into the garage. The rain had slowed, but I could hear water dripping from the gutters outside. Before I opened the door, I looked through the little square window in it. At first, all I saw was my car, the recycling bin, and the crooked shelves stacked with paint cans and Christmas decorations. Then I noticed the dome light glowing inside my car. I stood there, confused, because I clearly remembered turning the car off. I always looked back at the dashboard before getting out. It was one of my habits. The light made the windows look smoky, reflecting the garage ceiling in dull gray shapes. I leaned closer to the glass, thinking maybe I hadn't shut a door all the way. That was when I saw the outline in the back seat. A shoulder, a bent knee, the dark shape of a head turned slightly toward the house. Someone was sitting inside my car, perfectly still. I didn't scream. I think that's what scares me most when I remember it. My whole body went quiet, like every part of me understood before my mind did. I stepped backward 1 inch at a time, afraid even my socks against the tile would give me away. Mabel brushed against my ankle, and I nearly sobbed. I reached behind me, found the deadbolt on the kitchen door, and turned it as slowly as I could. The click sounded enormous. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the car door opened. I heard it clearly, that thick, rubbery pull followed by the faint dinging sound from the dashboard. Footsteps crossed the garage floor, slow at first, then faster. The handle on the kitchen door jerked once, hard enough to shake the blinds hanging over the window. I ran. I grabbed my phone from the counter, stumbled up the stairs to my office, and shoved my desk chair against the door, even though I knew it wouldn't stop much. Downstairs, the handle rattled again. Then someone knocked, softly, like they were trying to be polite. The dispatcher told me to stay upstairs and keep my voice low. I sat on the floor behind my desk, with one hand over my mouth, and the other gripping the phone so tightly my fingers cramped. Below me, I heard movement in the garage, a box shifting, something metal tipping over, then silence. That silence felt alive. Police lights finally flashed against my office wall. red and blue sliding over framed photos and unpaid bills. Officers surrounded the house and ordered whoever was inside to come out. He didn't. They found him crouched behind my storage shelves, wedged between a cooler and a stack of old moving boxes. He was a man in his 40s, soaked from the rain, with no real explanation that made sense. Later, an officer told me he admitted he'd seen the open garage from the street and slipped in while I was carrying groceries. He planned to wait until I fell asleep. I stayed with Nate for 2 weeks after that. I still live alone now, but not carelessly. I close the garage before I unbuckle my seatbelt. Safety, I learned, isn't paranoia. Sometimes it's the thin locked door between your life and someone waiting in the dark. I had been driving trucks for 11 years when the night I cannot explain finally caught up with me. Not the kind of inexplicable that dissolves under morning light or looks foolish when you try telling it over breakfast. The kind that stays lodged somewhere behind your sternum, like a splinter you cannot reach. I have told this story exactly 3 times, once to my wife, once to my brother, and once to a man at a roadside diner in Kentucky who looked at me the way people look at someone they believe, but wish they did not. Every time I tell it, I leave something out, not because I am protecting anyone or softening the edges for a nervous audience, but because certain details still do not feel safe to say out loud. I drove long haul out of Clarksburg, West Virginia, running regional freight mostly. Familiar roads, familiar dispatchers, familiar faces at the loading docks. I was not a superstitious man. I was a practical one. 11 years behind the wheel of a Kenworth T680 will cure you of romanticism pretty thoroughly. You learn that the road is just asphalt and painted lines, that strange noises have mechanical explanations, and that the loneliness of overnight runs is something your body eventually stops noticing, the way it stops noticing the smell of diesel. My name is Daniel Hayes. I was 43 years old the night I took that load. I have not driven that highway since, and I never will again. It was a Tuesday in late October when dispatch called me at 9:15 in the evening. I remember the time because I had just settled into my recliner with a reheated plate of my wife Karen's pot roast, and the game was 20 minutes from kickoff. Jerry Colton was on the line, one of the night dispatchers I had worked with for going on 6 years. Jerry was not a man who wasted words or called drivers at home without reason, so when I heard the particular flatness in his voice, I sat up straighter before he had finished his opening sentence. A load had come in late, pharmaceutical supplies bound for a distribution warehouse outside of Charleston. The driver originally assigned, a guy named Pete Sorrells who had been running that corridor for longer than I had been with the company, had refused the job without giving any explanation beyond the words, "Not that one." Jerry said Pete had walked off the dock, climbed back into his personal vehicle, and driven home. No write-up, no argument, just gone. The shipping company was offering double the standard rate for overnight delivery, with arrival before 6 in the morning. They needed someone who knew the mountain routes and could leave within the hour. I asked Jerry if there was anything wrong with the load. He said the manifest was clean, the trailer had been inspected, and everything checked out on paper. I asked him why Pete refused. Jerry was quiet for a moment, then said he honestly did not know, and that Pete was not answering his phone. Double pay was double pay. Karen gave me the look she always gave me when a job felt slightly off to her, that quiet, watchful expression she never translated into words, because she trusted my judgment even when she disagreed with it. I kissed her on the cheek, changed into my work clothes, and was on the road by 10:15. The first 2 hours were ordinary in every way that matters. Route 19 north to the interchange, then cutting southeast into the mountains on roads I had driven dozens of times in all kinds of weather. The October air was cold and clear, which made for good visibility and dry pavement. My coffee was fresh from the thermos Karen always filled for me without being asked. The radio was running a late sports program out of Morgantown, and I was comfortable in the way that experienced drivers get comfortable, alert but settled, the truck an extension of my own body. I passed through 2 small towns and a stretch of forest that went on for about 12 miles without a gas station or a light source of any kind. Normal mountain driving. I had done it 100 times. I was not thinking about Pete Sorrells or his refusal. I was not thinking about anything except the road ahead, and whether I would make good time on the grade coming up past the county line. That was when I pulled into the way station. The way station on that stretch of highway was one of those older facilities that felt like it belonged to a different decade. Low concrete building, a single floodlight mounted above the scale pad, a narrow strip of gravel for drivers to park while paperwork got checked. At that hour, the booth was unstaffed, which was common enough on overnight runs through that corridor. I pulled onto the scale pad out of habit, waited for the green light, and then eased the truck forward into the parking strip to check my logbook before the next long grade. I poured a second cup of coffee, made my entries, and was reaching for the radio dial when I heard it. Footsteps. That is the only word for it, though I turned it over in my mind for weeks afterward trying to find a better one. A steady rhythmic sound moving along the passenger side of the truck, gravel shifting under something with weight behind it, slow and deliberate, moving from the front axle toward the rear of the trailer. I set my coffee down. I sat completely still. The sound continued, unhurried, the way a person walks when they are not trying to get anywhere quickly. When it reached the back of the trailer, it stopped. I waited 30 seconds, that felt considerably longer. Then I reached up and switched on the exterior camera display mounted above my dash. The way station had its own fixed security camera on a pole near the booth, and I could see the gravel strip clearly in the floodlight. Nothing was there. Not an animal, not a person, not anything. Clean gravel, my truck, empty air. I sat with my hand on the door handle for a full minute before I convinced myself that sound travels strangely off concrete and mountain walls, that an animal could have crossed behind the trailer and moved into the dark before I checked the camera, that there was a perfectly sensible explanation for what I had heard. I pulled back onto the highway and kept driving. I want to be precise about the timeline because the sequence matters. The way station incident happened at approximately 12:40 in the morning. The first movement in the sleeper happened at around 1:15, roughly 35 miles further down the mountain route. I had not stopped again. I had not opened the sleeper door. I had not heard anyone or anything since leaving the way station. I was on a long curve that required my full attention, watching my mirrors and managing my speed on the grade, when I became aware of a sound behind me that had no business being there. It was subtle enough that I told myself I imagined it. A soft shifting, like fabric moving against fabric, like someone adjusting themselves on a mattress. I do not startle easily. 11 years of overnight driving teaches you to separate genuine alarm from the ordinary sounds a truck makes when it is loaded and working on an incline. I ran through the mechanical explanations first. Load shift in the trailer, something unsecured in the cab storage, the cab itself flexing on the frame. I kept driving. 2 minutes later, I heard it again. Clearer this time. The specific complaint of a mattress spring under a change in weight. I pulled over onto a wide gravel shoulder, left the engine running, and opened the sleeper compartment door. The overhead light came on automatically. The bunk was exactly as I had left it that morning. Blanket folded at the foot, pillow against the cab wall, my spare jacket hanging on the hook, my road atlas on the shelf. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was there. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at every corner of that small space with the particular attention of a man who wants very much to find a rational explanation. I checked under the bunk, which barely had room for the storage box I kept there. I opened the overhead cabinet and the side compartment. Empty, latched, normal. I pulled the sleeper door shut and sat back down behind the wheel. I told myself it was the load shifting. I told myself it was the mountain air playing with sound. I put the truck in gear and drove on, and the road unreeled ahead of me through the dark, and I tried very hard to believe my own explanations. By 2 in the morning, I had stopped believing them entirely. The activity had a rhythm to it that felt purposeful, in a way I cannot fully articulate. a quality of intention that separated it from random mechanical noise. My coffee cup, which I had set in the console holder between my right hand and the gear shift, was on the dash when I glanced down during a straightaway. Not fallen over, not rolled. Simply placed on the dash as if someone had moved it there carefully. My logbook, which I keep on the passenger seat, was gone for approximately 4 minutes before I found it resting on the sleeper mattress behind me when I turned to check. The blanket at the foot of the bunk had moved, not fallen to the floor, not pulled aside dramatically, just moved in the way a blanket moves when someone sits down on the edge of the mattress. I turned on my CB radio. I was not sure who I was going to talk to or what I was going to say. The first voice that came back to me was a driver named Chester, who identified himself as running north about 20 miles ahead of me. I told him I was having a strange night. He asked me what route I was on, and I told him. There was a pause that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Chester asked me, quietly and without any theatrical emphasis whatsoever, if I had picked anyone up. I told him I had not. He said that was good, that I should keep my eyes on the road and not look at the mirrors any more than I needed to. I asked him what he meant. He said there was a driver who used to run that mountain corridor, a man who had been killed in a jackknife accident somewhere on that road in the early 1980s, and that certain drivers believed he was still out there looking for a way back. Chester said he had heard the sounds himself once, years ago, on the same stretch. He had pulled over, refused to continue, and waited for daylight before driving out. He told me that was the only advice he had. I thanked him, and kept driving because I was 43 miles from the delivery point, and the sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of approaching dawn at the far edge of the eastern ridgeline. It was at the next straightaway, a long flat section between 2 grades where I habitually glanced at my side mirror to check trailer sway, that I saw the reflection clearly. A figure, seated on the edge of my bunk, facing forward, completely still. I cannot tell you with any certainty what the figure looked like beyond the basic outline of a person sitting quietly in the dark of a sleeper cab. I looked back at the road immediately, the way you do when survival instinct overrides every other impulse. When I checked the mirror again, the bunk was empty. I did not stop. I drove the remaining 43 miles without looking at that mirror once. I backed the trailer into the loading dock at the Charleston distribution warehouse at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the delivery deadline. The dock supervisor, a heavy-set man in a yellow safety vest whose name tag read Gordy, walked me through the paperwork with the brisk efficiency of someone who had processed 1,000 overnight deliveries and regarded each one as interchangeable with the last. I signed where he indicated. He handed me my copy. 2 of his crew began opening the trailer doors while a third operated the dock lift. I was leaning against the cab, drinking the last of my cold coffee, and thinking about nothing except a bed and several hours of uninterrupted sleep, when Gordy came back around the side of the truck, with a look on his face that I recognized as the specific expression people wear when they are deciding whether to say something. He said it casually, the way people deliver information they assume is unremarkable. He said that his guys mentioned someone had been sitting in the sleeper the whole way in, waving through the little rear window, and they had figured it was my co-driver or something. He asked if my co-driver was still back there. I set my coffee cup on the side step very carefully. I said I did not have a co-driver. I said I had driven that load alone. Gordy looked at me for a moment, then looked back at his crew, then looked at the truck. He said, "Huh," and then seemed to decide that the paperwork was more important than whatever had just been said, and walked back toward his office. I stood beside the Kenworth in the gray morning light and looked at the sleeper window. The glass was slightly fogged from the inside, the way glass fogs when something warm has been sitting close to it. I called Karen from the dock parking lot. I told her I was done with long haul. She did not ask me why. She just said she would have breakfast ready when I got home. I turned my resignation in by phone that afternoon and never drove that highway again. There is something the road teaches you if you spend enough years on it, and it is not what most people expect. It does not teach you that the world is large and mysterious and full of wonder, though perhaps it does that too. Mostly it teaches you that the line between the ordinary and the inexplicable is thinner than anyone is comfortable admitting, and that some questions are not answered by pressing further into the dark. I do not know what shared that cab with me on that October night. I do not know whether Pete Sorrells understood something I did not, or whether Chester's story about that old crash was true, or whether the figure in my mirror and the shape in that warehouse window were the same thing, or two different things, or nothing at all. What I know is that the warehouse workers saw it too, from the outside, in the early morning light, with no reason to invent it. What I know is that some loads are refused for reasons that make no sense on paper and complete sense in practice. What I know is that there are roads that carry more than freight, and that the wisest thing a person can sometimes do is simply pull over, sign the paperwork, and go home. My name is Brandon Calloway, and I was 31 years old the summer we drove to Las Vegas for Kyle Mercer's bachelor party. Kyle was marrying a woman named Dana who was, by every reasonable measure, too good for him, and Kyle knew it and said so regularly, which was one of the reasons we all liked him so much. The five of us had been friends since high school in Kansas City, the kind of friendship that survives college and different cities, and years of sporadic contact because it is built on something more durable than proximity. Kyle, Ethan Marsh, Lucas Freed, Owen Darby, and me. We had talked about doing a proper trip together for years, the kind that requires actual coordination and a shared calendar and someone responsible enough to book the hotel before the good rooms disappear. That someone was always me, which is why I was driving, and why I am the one telling this story. We left Kansas City on a Friday morning in late June, 5 grown men crammed into my Chevy Tahoe with a cooler of drinks in the back, and enough luggage for a 2-week vacation despite the fact that we were gone for 3 nights. The mood was exactly what you would expect. Lucas had made a playlist that nobody except Lucas fully endorsed. Owen had already started on the road snacks before we cleared the city limits. Ethan, who worked as a high school history teacher and maintained a certain dignity about it, was reading a paperback in the back seat with the focused expression of a man determined not to participate in whatever was happening around him. Kyle was in the passenger seat beside me, wearing a novelty sash that Dana had packed into his bag as a joke, alternating between grinning at his phone and pointing out landmarks that were not interesting. For the first several hours, everything was exactly as it should have been. We made good time through Kansas on the interstate, stopped once for gas and food outside of Salina, and were feeling generally excellent about the weekend ahead when the first closure sign appeared. A digital highway board 3 miles ahead of the Colby interchange read both westbound lanes closed, 37-mile detour, follow marked route. I said something I will not repeat here, and Lucas said it louder, and we followed the detour signs off the interstate onto a state route that none of us had ever heard of. The state route was the kind of road that exists in the middle of the country, in large quantities, without anyone who does not live nearby ever needing to think about it. 2 lanes, flat, straight, surrounded on both sides by farmland that stretch to the horizon, with the particular indifference of land that has never needed to impress anyone. The detour signs were clear for the first 40 miles, and then became inconsistent in a way that made me slow down at every junction to verify we were still on the correct path. Cell service had been unreliable since we left the interstate, and disappeared completely somewhere around the 2nd hour on the state route. The GPS on my phone was working off a cached map that did not include every small road in rural western Kansas, which meant I was navigating partly by the direction of the sun, which was setting ahead of us, and partly by following the larger road at each intersection and hoping for the best. We stopped for gas at a small station attached to a grain elevator outside a town of perhaps 400 people, and the attendant, an older man who seemed mildly surprised to see out-of-state plates, told us the next station was about 60 miles further, and that we should have enough to make it if we were not running low. We were not running low. We continued west as the sun finished setting, and the farmland went dark around us, and the road ahead was lit only by my headlights and the occasional distant security light on a grain bin or equipment shed. By midnight, the easy atmosphere in the car had shifted into something quieter, without anyone deciding to shift it. Lucas had turned the playlist down several hours earlier. Ethan had put his book away. Owen was asleep against the rear window, and Kyle was checking his phone periodically, with the automatic gesture of someone who knows the signal is gone, but keeps looking anyway. I had not seen another vehicle in either direction for somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, which in daylight on that road would have been unremarkable, but in the dark felt like a different kind of isolation. I made a comment about it, something about how we were officially in the middle of nowhere, and Kyle said at least nobody could bother us out here, and that was the exact moment the red and blue lights appeared in my rearview mirror. My first feeling was simple annoyance, the standard reaction of someone who believes they have done nothing wrong and is about to lose 15 minutes proving it. I checked my speed, which was 2 miles under the limit, signaled, and pulled onto the gravel shoulder the way I had been taught to do. We all sat up straighter automatically, Owen waking without being told, everyone moving their hands to visible positions out of the collective instinct that comes from being raised in a country where you understand the protocol for these situations. I said it was probably just a routine check, out-of-state plates on a back road at midnight, and they all agreed, and we waited for the officer to approach. He did not approach for several minutes. That was the first thing. I watched in the mirror, and the vehicle behind us sat with its lights running, and nobody got out. The lights themselves were wrong in a way I could not immediately identify, and then could. They were too dim. Police emergency lights are built for visibility, designed to be seen from distance in all weather conditions. These were visible but muted, like the lights on a vehicle where the system was partially failing or had been deliberately altered. The SUV behind us had no visible markings that I could make out in the mirror, no unit numbers on the door, no light bar of the kind mounted on every state patrol vehicle I had ever seen. There was a single portable light unit in the windshield, the kind available for purchase at auto supply stores. Kyle said something quiet, and I nodded without responding. When the man finally got out, he was wearing dark clothing that resembled a uniform without being one, the way a costume resembles the real thing from a distance and fails closer up. He walked to my window and I lowered it, and he said good evening and asked where we were headed. His voice was calm. His face was neutral. He was not wearing a visible badge. I told him Las Vegas, and he nodded and asked where we were staying. I told him, and he wrote something down on a notepad and asked if anyone was expecting us that night. The question landed wrong on everyone in the car simultaneously. I felt Kyle go still beside me and heard Ethan shift in the back seat. I answered that our hotel was expecting us, and he nodded again and asked if we were carrying cash. I said I did not think that was relevant to a traffic stop. He moved past that and asked if anyone in the vehicle owned a firearm. I said I was not going to answer questions that were outside the scope of why he had stopped us, and asked him to explain the reason for the stop. He did not answer that directly either. Instead, he said he needed one of the passengers to step out of the vehicle and that the rest of us should remain inside. He was looking at Ethan when he said it. I did not look at Ethan because I did not want to give anything away, but I heard Kyle's hand move to his phone in the dark between the seats. I said, in the most level voice I could produce, that before anyone exited the vehicle, I was going to call 911 to verify the stop and confirm his badge number and department, and that this was our right, and we were exercising it. I already had the phone in my hand. The change in him was immediate and total, in a way that I have replayed many times since. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He did not ask another question. He simply looked at me for 2 seconds, with an expression I cannot fully describe, except to say that it was not the expression of a man caught in a misunderstanding. It was the expression of a man recalculating. Then he turned and walked back to his SUV, at a pace that was unhurried but purposeful. and before I had finished dialing, the lights behind us went dark, and the vehicle pulled out onto the road and accelerated into the west, and was gone. I sat with 911 ringing on my phone, and looked at Kyle, and Kyle looked at me, and neither of us said anything while the dispatcher picked up and asked for my emergency. I told her we had just been approached on a state route in western Kansas by someone in a vehicle with emergency lights who had not identified himself as law enforcement and had asked several concerning questions before leaving when I told him I was calling to verify the stop. She took our location from Kyle, who had sent it to his brother during the stop and still had the coordinates on his screen, and she told us to stay where we were. Real state troopers arrived in just under 20 minutes. The trooper who spoke with me was a woman named Sergeant Welch, who had the precise, careful manner of someone who had taken statements in difficult situations many times before. She confirmed, without hesitation, that there were no law enforcement vehicles assigned to that stretch of highway that night. She took detailed descriptions of the man and the vehicle and then told us, in the measured tone of someone delivering information that is serious, without being designed to alarm, that there had been several similar reports in the region over the past 18 months. A man in a vehicle fitted with aftermarket emergency lights had been stopping travelers on isolated roads late at night, asking questions focused on cash, firearms, and whether anyone knew the traveler's whereabouts. In each reported case, the individual had left when the traveler either called or threatened to call 911. In one case, he had not left immediately, and that case was still under active investigation. She did not give us details about that one. She told us we had handled the situation correctly, and that we should continue to our destination and file a written report when we reached Las Vegas, which we did. We made Las Vegas by 4 in the morning and sat in the hotel room for an hour before anyone felt like sleeping. The weekend happened. Kyle got married 2 months later. We have all continued living our ordinary lives in the years since, and none of it looks different from the outside. But none of us pull over automatically on empty roads anymore. We talked about it as a group, not formally, but in the way that people who have shared something significant talk about it, in pieces, over time, until a shared understanding forms. If a stop feels wrong, if the lights are wrong, if the questions are wrong, you drive. You keep your doors locked, and you drive toward light and population, and you call 911 while you are driving, and you tell the dispatcher where you are going and why. A real officer will understand. A real officer will follow you to a safe location. The man who does not follow you to a safe location, who turns off his lights and disappears the moment you reach for your phone, was never there to enforce any law that was written to protect you. The road is long, and most of it is safe, and most people driving it mean nothing except to get where they are going. But the middle of nowhere is called that for a reason. And the most important thing you can carry on an empty highway at midnight is the willingness to trust what does not feel right, even when everything visible is telling you to comply.